I've been in Putnam 3 years, and I've only been working on Rufus for, I think we figured out 5 months. So I'm so new at this, and I'm totally fascinated by it. I'm totally hooked. I came in here, and I was looking to find out who this person was that's buried in our pasture. Because there's a cemetery, I don't know if you're familiar, up Route 44, past the hospital on the right-hand side, there's a square cemetery with an obelisk in it. And when we moved in, I thought, who is this person? I need to find out. And that's where it started. I came here, and this is what you can kind of see from the road, the one in the middle there. And you know, people would say to me, oh yeah, I've heard the story about Rufus and Dolly, but I came in here to the Aspinock Historical Society, and the minute I came in, I felt so welcome, and they were so helpful. Bill was bringing me things and every time I would come in, I was supposed to be volunteering on Thursdays, and every time I came in, I was working on Rufus because everyone had so much little, they had knowledge and so many little tidbits that they would find. And then I started looking on Ancestry, and then Maggie came in. I was introduced to Maggie, and Maggie said, oh, you know, please come over to our historical society. And oh my goodness, it's blossomed from there. This is such a work in progress. And there's so much information that's not even on here. There's all kinds of different leads, and I'm sure any of you who have ever done any kind of investigating, one thing leads you to another. Every time I find something new about him and I think I've got it, it leads me somewhere else with another question. So there are still some things that we don't know, and I'm really, really wanting to figure them out. It's just very exciting. So this is what I've learned so far. What do we know about Rufus? We know that he died, excuse me, on October 12th, 1884, because that's what it says on his monument. Rufus G. Malbone died October 12th, 1884, aged 60 years, 8 months, and 20 days. And so I used a calculator that you can get online. Everything is online. It's so cool. You can write that, and then it will tell you when his birth date was. And that calculated to January 22nd, 1824. So these are not pictures that I took. These are pictures if you go to Find a Grave. This is what is on there. And I finally got downstairs, and I got into the vital records, and this is what was there. Some of these are going to be very hard to read. They're not very clear when you take a picture of them, or they don't show up very clear on Ancestry when you take a picture of them. But this is his death certificate, and it shows that he was single. There's no date of birth. His age at death was 60 years and 9 months. They kind of rounded it up. And he was a black African male. He was a farmer. That's what was listed as his occupation, and his cause of death was paralysis. This is not a picture of Rufus, but this is what I picture him to look like. I Googled a bunch of pictures, and this one just seemed like what I could picture him doing on the property. And we still haven't found, all of us have not found any pictures of him, which is why when the presentation is over, Terry helped me print up a little pamphlet. If you wouldn't mind taking one, and maybe you can talk to someone, or you know someone that knows something or a story or has a picture, I would love that, please, if you could give me that information. What do we know about him? Well, most stories that are written descriptions say that he was a freed black man. He was very robust and of legendary strength. That he was of modest means. He didn't have an awful lot. That's what the stories say. He was a farmer who bartered and sold his or other people's goods locally. He was seen on the streets around town. But what was his life like? Was he ever married? Did he have children? And who was Dolly? So there's a local legend about Rufus and his horse Dolly. There are many, many stories about that and legends. However, they don't all agree. One thing they do agree on is that they were inseparable. You always hear about Rufus and Dolly and how much he cared about his horse. They were often seen traveling our local area roads with Dolly pulling the wagon, and they would sell farm produce off of the wagon that he had either grown on his farm or bartered for. None of the accounts say how long they were together, only that he had Dolly since she was very, very young, and that she was a really a very fine horse. That's a quote from one of the legends, and that she was fast enough to be a racehorse. She was quite intelligent, and that no one else had ever driven her from Rufus. It was well known, however, how inseparable they were and how much he loved his horse. This is from Legendary Connecticut. David E. Phillips is the author, and this is what he imagined Dolly looked like. That's from his book. It's kind of what I thought she looked like too. I pictured her. One day a tragic accident happened to the pair while they were on their way to the Bartholomew farm. Sometimes they name a specific person or a farm in some of these stories, and so that is one of the things that I'm also investigating, because that's a familiar name on some of the censuses. So they were on their way with a load of cider apples when a wagon wheel fell off, and Rufus was known to be big and strong, and if a wagon wheel fell off, he would get under the wagon and lift it up with his legs and then somehow get the wagon wheel back on. So this particular day, a wagon wheel fell off, and we can go to the next one. That's okay. And Dolly, she was waiting patiently by, but this time, the strain of it, and then we go back to where it says cause of death was paralysis. From the strain of it, he passed out. And there were two men that had been following him along the road with goods of their own in a wagon. They stopped and carried Rufus back to his little home, and they placed him in bed. Just 10 days later, Rufus died from his injuries, it said, and many of them, only a few times regaining his consciousness, and he was always asking about Dolly. That's all he worried about the whole time. And according to the stories, he made arrangements during that time to have his precious horse provided for. He gave specific instructions. He wanted her taken care of, but also he wanted her buried with him when her time came. So he did pass away, but when he did, Dolly became inconsolable. She wouldn't listen to anyone. The neighbors had to take care of her. She wouldn't eat. No one else had ever driven her. So, go ahead and change that. Thank you. They decided, since she wasn't owned anymore and no one could sell her, that something had to be done, and it would be best if they reunited her with Rufus. Just 2 weeks after he passed, a bigger hole was dug beside his grave, and the nearest neighbor to him volunteered to shoot her and to put her in the grave with him. She was laid to rest with Rufus, and later in some other documents I found out that the neighbor's name was Dresser, Abel Dresser. So there's a monument that was put up. It doesn't say who, but it was erected according to his instructions and the money he had left behind for that. It would say Dolly, his faithful horse, died October 25th, 1884. That's a close-up of it. It's very hard to read when it's far away. But that is on the same side of the obelisk that marks Rufus's grave. And thanks to Bill came running over to me one day with this calendar from the Aspinock Historical Society that had Rufus Malbone and Dolly on there, and he said, "Look what I found." And this is what would go on when I would come here to do research. They would find things in articles and maps, and they would bring them to me. So
What year is that calendar?
that one was 1990, I believe. I think it says it, yes, 1990. Yes, and then on the back of it is the story of Rufus and Dolly. It was really neat. And
You want to go back?
nope, thank you. There's other places that spoke of the story of Rufus and Dolly, and some have pictures, some are just small little articles, but there's been a lot of places that I found things about Rufus. This one was given to me again by Bill. And they all talk about the legend. This one is historically speaking. This was a book that I just copied the front page of it because I believe there's 6 pages. But R.A. Kurland of the Norwich Historical Society, he did a program, I believe, on Wednesdays. Is that right, Maggie? You said that it was...
He did articles in the Norwich Bulletin, historical articles from all around eastern Connecticut, I believe.
Yeah, so this, when I Googled this is what came up. So I don't know if it was part of, there were more chapters about other people, but this is telling with a lot of detail, and I think he took, he's a good storyteller. There's a lot of parts I think that he added to the story in there and made it really interesting.
Thing to keep in mind, though, with all of these is all of these that are written like this is their oral history. They're all talking about a legend. So when he said son of a slave, we haven't found any documentation at all that says that Rufus Malbone was a son of a slave. So there's a kernel of truth in all of these local legends, but you have to learn to pick out the true facts and go from there and try to document what you find.
He was the son of a slave in Pomfret, Malburns.
Excuse me?
He was the son of the Malburns in Pomfret. They were a slave family. Down to Dufferin, they were
That he was a slave. Oh, that would be wonderful if you could share that, please. Because a lot of times, I'm sure you guys all know this, that documentation wasn't really well kept when it was someone who was African American. If it was even written about at all, like Rufus's date of birth wasn't even on his death certificate, so who knows who actually helped with his death certificate. But we're going to keep digging and see what we can make of it. I'll talk about it later, but I started with Godfrey Malbone of Newport, Rhode Island, who had a lot of slaves, and a lot of the stories talk about Rufus being the son of a freed slave that was given his master's name. So I have to find a document that says that, but that's what the stories say. This is another place that his story shows up in Notable and Notorious, and that's the front and back. Those are the cover pages of it. And this is the actual article. And again, it talks about Rufus and Dolly. It's a little bit shorter version, but they all talk about how she was put in the grave with Rufus. This one, and this is what happens. Yesterday, Maggie found something else and sent it to me. We just keep adding and adding. We just keep finding more and more, and it's wonderful. So she sent me this, and this is from genealogybank.com about Rufus and Dolly. But this is different. It has a different title, a different kind of feel to it. 2 Mounds of Clay, and they talk about specifics in this one about how she was buried. She was killed and buried, placed by his side in the yard near the house That's one of the things that's making me crazy. Where on our property was Rufus's house? Because there's nothing obvious, like a foundation or anything that we've been able to find yet. So, and it says about a dozen yards from the old house where Rufus lived. And when this was done, this was November 7th, probably 1884, because it said he just passed away. Back then, you know, a lot of time has passed, but back then, you could see the two mounds because they were fresh. So, thank you, Maggie, for that article.
I believe it was in a New Haven newspaper. And it's the only one I've found so far.
So while I was searching, one of the things I was doing was, when I first came in here, was to see who Rufus was, but also where was his house? What kind of information was there? And I started going through, Bill helped me take down those big volumes, those bound books that have the newspapers that are the Putnam Patriot, and during certain years, I had no idea what year Rufus lived there, none of that. So it was, I tried microfiche, could not do that. That was too difficult for me. So he actually let me carefully go through the volumes, and as I was going through, I found this article about Rufus and an A.S. Granger who were in violation of the dog law. I'd like to go into court records, see if I can find anything. I thought that was kind of interesting. That's nothing that is on Ancestry, so this was kind of different. And you know, the idea that you can kind of get a little bit about his personality. What was he fighting about with his dog? You know, what did he do wrong? I just thought that was neat to include in here. And so, where did he live? He lived on our property in, like I explained before, Route 44 past Hospital Hill, and it was back then Pomfret until Putnam became Putnam in 1855. I have a map that Bill Pearsall gave to me from 1869 that shows him on there, and I'll show that to you in a second. His name is spelled wrong. His name is spelled quite a few different ways, so according to who heard it, what they thought it sounded like, you know, maybe phonetically sometimes, but there's a map that shows where it was, and it was, if you're familiar where Gary Schoolhouse Road is and the blinking light there, he owned all the way up to there, and I found out later across the street from that as well, going, I think it's Modoc Road, he owned across over there. So it says R. Malbone, but it is Rufus Malbone. And that's a big map, that's just a corner of where it was. This is from actually downstairs when I went to look at land records for our property. And so he bought this property on the 8th of September 1868 when he was still of Providence, Rhode Island. And like Maggie just gave me new information, maybe of Pomfret too, but it doesn't say, it's kind of neat the way they word it, but it doesn't say how many acres. It just tells you what the land, you know, how it sits according to such and such a neighbor, bounded by so-and-so's property over by the stream, and you know, they do it that way. They didn't talk about rods in this one, but a lot of them show the measurements in rods when you're looking up these old properties. So a possible family member, Othello Malbone, shows up on this. This is, I believe, the warranty deed that Caroline and Sanford Randall sold to him. Their names also appear around that neighborhood. These are all neighbors of his that he's buying land off of. So he had quite a list, on the next page we'll see, of transactions. So I'm already thinking, this guy isn't just a poor black farmer with an acre or two. This guy works hard, and he's he's putting his money into these pieces of property. So Maggie showed me how to go downstairs and look up grantor and grantee, and that was a great adventure. So these are the things that I came up with. He did quite a few transactions, and then the ones at the bottom, his estate after he passed, it shows a bunch of heirs on there, and in all the censuses, it says that he was single, he never married, so, and no children. So, you know, every little nugget that I get from a page leads me to another, which leads me to another question, which leads me to another mystery, but this is what we could find downstairs, you know, as far as how much he purchased. Sometimes it didn't say where the blank is down there, how many acres it was. There was no description. But we put the, you know, I put it into chronological order. And at the bottom, for the sum of $1,550, there's a warranty deed, you know, from his heirs selling it to a Daniel Cox. That's important because Daniel Cox is the person that they talk about when Rufus's house and farm buildings burnt down. So that led me to that. So then I went on a search for the information about the fire. We can go to the next one. And I will get to that in a minute. This is very hard to read. This is the best I could do. This was on Ancestry. You can't read it. You have to actually look on the screen on your computer when you're looking at Ancestry to actually read it. So the next page, I wrote down the information. And it's, you know, if you think about it, where did he get $1,000 to buy this property that they're talking about in this census, right? What did he do for a living? Well, he was a drayer, a teamster, a farmer, a laborer, and he did produce, according to this census, and this was in 1880 when he was 56 years old. This is the state of Connecticut production of agriculture form. He was the sole owner, and he had 25 acres of tilled, including fallow and grass, in rotation of pasture or meadow. They were permanent pastures. There were 35 acres of other unimproved, including old fields, not growing, that were wooded. $3,000 worth of farm, including land, fences, and building. $500 of livestock. $300 estimated value of all farm production in 1879, sold, consumed, or on land. And there's still more. 15 acres of mown, 10 acres not mown land. Products harvested in 1879, 10 tons of hay, 10 bushels of clover seed, and 10 bushels of grass seed. This is just that year. 3 horses of all ages on hand as of June 1st, 1880. As of June 1st, 1880, also on hand was, and they spelled it M-I-L-C-H, milk cow, 1 other, and 1 calved of neat cattle and their products. These were the categories. A lamb was dropped in the movement of 1879, and there were 20 swine on hand as of June 1st. There were 20 barnyard poultry on hand as of June 1st, exclusive of spring hatching. 50 dozen eggs were produced in 1879. 2 acres of Indian corn cereals, which were 50 bushels of crop, and 1.5 acres of Irish potatoes, 50 bushels of crop. So this guy, he did a lot of work, and it was just him. It doesn't say anything ever about him having farm hands. It was just him. No family helped him. So he worked, and he did a lot of work. Besides doing that, he also, besides being a farmer, the censuses say that he had additional income coming in from draying. I had never heard that word before. A drayer is a driver that, kind of like the first Teamsters, had a wagon and drove a wagon. It doesn't say he was a coachman. It just said that he was a drayer. So I'm thinking farm produce, products, that kind of thing. And he had income from that as well as being a Teamster. a laborer, and then both in Pomfret and Putnam, as well as Providence, Rhode Island. So I'm trying to figure out if he spent some time, maybe this summer, and took his harvest into Providence. Maybe the winter he stayed in Pomfret, which became Putnam, because he's got different addresses. It shows him boarding or renting at various locations in Providence. This particular one here shows that he was a teamster from 1864, and he boarded at Potter's Ave. This one is an April 1865 census that talks about his taxes in Providence, Rhode Island. He's also on Potter Ave at that point, the next year. January 1865 taxes in Providence. He was draying. He was at a different address, Carpenter's Point. This one, it's probably Carpenter's Point. We tried to figure that out. I actually asked several people that were in the room at the time that with our little magnifying plastic thing, we all looked at it and we couldn't figure it out. It looks like Carpenter's Point was abbreviated, so it's probably that, and since it's the next year, it seems like that's the address that he would have. This one is a new address, 5 Rice, where he boards, and this is U.S. City Directories 1872 in Providence. This one, he's listed as white. If you do a digital search for him on Ancestry about this census, but if you look in the census and you hover over it and you also blow the screen up, it says B for him being black. So that was June of 1880. This one, in any of the listings, he's always single. This one, you question, was he ever married? Did he have family? But there are some of these censuses where a John Malbone shows up with him living in the same place. And this one is free inhabitants in the town of Pomfret, and it was the 25th of July, 1850. And Maggie, 1852, you said you found information about him having a place in Pomfret?
In 1850, I went to Pomfret Town Hall to their land records, and in 1852, Othello Malbone, unfortunately no relationships given, sells 1 acre of land to Rufus, and at that point in time, it's in Pomfret. When Putnam is set off, it becomes part of the town of Putnam. That's 1852. So he had shown up in the 1850 census under the name Mallon, but we figured it was Rufus. And then in 1852, he's purchasing land, which is becomes part of the larger property that he then has.
And
So that's 1852, and in 1853 he mortgages the property, and I can tell from that deed that he's literate, or at least to the extent where he can sign his own name. It's not marked with an X.
And she found this yesterday. So, and she texted me with, Mark, you found this yesterday, and you texted me.
I found it yesterday.
You sending me
I'm
more.
always looking. Oh, it's like a disease.
It's so fun though. It's very exciting. So this John Malbone that he was living with was married, and his wife's name was Harriet Malbone. Now, we don't know if John D. Malbone is the same person that Maggie has found. There might be 2 John Malbones.
I'm working on that. I'm working on that today at the Pillyway Historical Center.
But the John Malbone that I found, there's nothing about where he's buried. We have his death, but not where he's buried. And we have Harriet, and I'll get to that in a minute. We have Harriet showing up in Grove Street from the information that I found here at Aspinock, She's in Grove Street Cemetery, and she's not in there as Harriet Malbone, she is Mrs. John Malbone. So you have to figure out which John Malbone we're talking about, but this is from, and she's considered an aunt in this population schedule. She's the widowed wife of John D. Malbone, and it's Putnam City Directory's 1900. She lived into, I believe, 1930s. I'll check that in a second, but she's listed as an aunt. She's in a household of George Putnam, and they show other members, but not only her as a Malbone. This one is the close-up of it, and it talks about, sorry, that's okay. It talks about she's a black female. Her birth month is March 1835. She's 65. She's widowed. No children born or living. Birthplace, Connecticut, USA. Father's birthplace is Connecticut, but mother was born in Rhode Island. Her occupation was dressmaking. Months not employed were 2. She attended school. It just has nothing there. Can she read? Yes. Can she write? Yes. Can she speak English? Yes. So this is what it looks like when you try to blow it up on Ancestry. It's very hard to see sometimes. It's really hard when you take a picture of it. And this is my notes, and it was going to be just too hard to try to draw it again. But these are Rufus's heirs that hired George Pettis, Esquire, to sell his property in 1885. That's a year after he died, to Daniel Cox. These are the names of the people on there. Harriet L. Malbone is listed as his heir. We don't know how they're connected, but she's one of his heirs. And Daniel Cox is the person that I find the article about the fire in the Putnam, it's not the Town Crier, is it Putnam Patriot? So this map here, this is the only one I need to stand over here,
That's fine.
I think. So according to the way they described that first sale in 1868, these are the boundary lines. This was approximately 27 acres. This is Route 44, that's Gary's schoolhouse. And down here across the road, he had approximately 21 acres. And when you go down the dip, right before you come up to our property, there's a stream that goes under Route 44. And they used to use that brook as the property line to Perrin. I don't know if there's any relation. Excuse me. Lucia Perrin. And they had it before as an A Perrin. I'm so sorry. So according to where they described it, and then that new article with more information of how many yards it was from the house, and because of articles that we're finding in the dirt, we have dairy goats, and their little hooves are turning up pieces of pottery. And when I'm so sorry. When we went out to put a fence across our property in the pasture, there were these. Oh, I have gum in my mouth, and it's not helping.
You've got gum in your mouth.
I do. I'm going to just take a sip of water. I'm so sorry. But we're finding pieces of pottery and metal pieces, and I'll bring that up in a second. All kind of concentrated in one area of our pastures, and so it's driving me crazy. I lay awake at night trying to figure it out, where his house was. This is the square cemetery, and they said a few yards. This is also where we're finding midden. I don't know if it's kitchen midden, maybe cider mill midden, because they talk about him having a cider mill as well. So this is, where is it over here? Dresser. Abel Dresser is the guy that actually supposedly shot the horse Dolly to put her in the grave. So this is just my idea of it, and I'm still going to investigate all these people, but these heirs are in New Bedford, Mass. And these were from Providence. So more mysteries, more more questions.
How many more slides?
Okay. This is a portion of the power of attorney document signed by his heirs, and that's where I got the names from. And this was dated 27th of July, 1885, and it's from our land records that were in there. This one shows Harriet L., widow of John D., and then a seamstress as well. And it didn't give me a date exactly, it just said 1822 to 1995. And a lot of times they don't give a specific date. This one is the Windham County transcript. It has John Malbone described as the 25th of March in 1880. He just passed away. He was the colored coachman of Henry C. Bowen. On one of the maps, there's a Bowen that appears, and you just sent me something.
This is Henry Bowen of the Pink House.
Right.
Oh, okay.
That's who it is.
Yeah.
Okay, see, you knew this, I didn't know this.
Right. Well, we haven't talked since, I don't think we talked since you.
So, he was a coachman that, he drove famous people around, such as, generals and representatives. So this is, I contacted Jim Shaw of the Grove Street Cemetery Association because I was searching and searching and searching. I said, do you have any information about Harriet Malbone? He said, there are quite a few people that do not have headstones. So he put orange, it's still hard to see, he put orange flags where her grave lies. But he said there were a few that were moved from, Bill, I need your help with this, the name of the cemetery behind the dealership.
Right, behind it.
What's the name of the cemetery?
Wheelock
Wheelock.
Cemetery.
Wheelock Cemetery. When the Great Flood came through, they needed dirt. And apparently they went back there, they took dirt and maybe people's graves, and put that, actually, where we're standing, was it
Yes,
put up here as
a
well?
lot of, there was a big washout from the '55 flood right in this area where the trade school was.